New Chicago Bears offensive coordinator Shane Waldron is wasting no time in putting together his offensive staff. We'll learn more about a few coaches that could be following him from Seattle, as well as some other names to keep an eye on.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl for a first deposit match up to $100. On the show today, we look at the coaches that could be coming and are already interviewing for assistant positions under Shane Waldron with the Chicago Bears. A few guys that are likely to follow him from the Seattle Seahawks, as well as some other coaches he's worked with before that could be strong assistants in Chicago. And we got to kind of pierce out, like, how many assistant coaches is he actually going to have, and where can the Bears find a few loopholes to bring in guys that might not otherwise be available? We know that Matt Eberflus has essentially mandated that the offensive staff is retaining the previous offensive line coach, Chris Morgan, the previous tight ends coach, Jim Dre, and also, previous assistant offensive line coach in there as well. But the main position coaches there, O-line and tight end coach, still set from the previous staff. That's something Matt Eberflus has apparently insisted upon, and apparently Shane Waldron was okay enough with that to accept the offensive coordinator position. So at a minimum, that basically leaves that the Bears need a quarterbacks coach, a running backs coach, and a wide receivers coach. Now, there's room to add more coaches beyond that, and we'll get into some of those potential loopholes in a little bit. Certainly, though, you could have an assistant quarterbacks coach, an assistant wide receivers coach, assistant offensive line coach. There's ways to add more guys in that realm, and some other little loopholes as far as ways you can give guys promotions, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But for now, we know about 3 candidates that Shane Waldron has already brought in to interview, and presumably, because he worked with all 3 in Seattle, you would expect him to hire them in Chicago in some sort of role. We don't know, as I'm recording this, exactly what that will look like. There also are reportedly other names. There were 3 guys that were named by name, and then the report from, I think it was Jonathan Jones from CBS, said these 3 guys among others. So clearly more than just these 3 guys currently being looked at. But I want to take a little bit of time to go through the 3 names that we know about so far from Shane Waldron and his time with the Seattle Seahawks. Let's start with Chad Morton. Chad Morton was, if you recognize the name, he used to be a kickoff return specialist in the NFL in the early 2000s. Had some run with the Packers, I think, and the Jets. I think he made a Pro Bowl in there as well. I mean, he was a very good return man, and also played a little bit of running back, but wasn't as successful there as he was as a return man, but had some pretty big returns. I think he had 2 touchdowns in a game. One of the people like Devin Hester to have done that in NFL history. But Morton in Seattle was the Seahawks, most recently their run game coordinator and also their running backs coach. Previously, he was just their running backs coach, was promoted and added the running game coordinator title within the last couple of seasons in Seattle. Previously to being a running backs coach, he was a special teams assistant coach with the Seattle Seahawks, and he was even a special teams assistant coach for the Green Bay Packers for a couple of seasons as well. So has the special teams playing experience and coaching experience, and then mostly has been running backs coach, and now more recently, run game coordinator and running backs coach. You would imagine, as we just talked about, the Bears have an opening at running backs coach. They're interviewing the Seahawks running backs coach. Put 2 and 2 together, I would imagine that Chad Morton could be in line to be the Chicago Bears running backs coach. Another name that's being interviewed in Chicago was a name that Matt Eberflus interviewed 2 years ago as a potential offensive coordinator. Chose Luke Getsy instead, but at the time interviewed Sanjay Lal. I think it's pronounced Lal. It's L-A-L. It might be Lal. But regardless, Sanjay Lal was passed up for this Bears offensive coordinator position when he was, at the time, the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers coach. He's also been a long-time NFL wide receivers coach with the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Dallas Cowboys, the Indianapolis Colts, the Buffalo Bills, the New York Jets, the Oakland Raiders. We're talking that's 7 teams he's been wide receivers coach for. Never been an offensive coordinator. Had a chance to do that for the Bears 2 years ago, but ultimately the Bears passed on him. He was, like Chad Morton, though, Sanjay Lal was promoted to be passing game coordinator in addition to wide receivers coach. So he's got that. It's not coordinating experience per se, but he was the passing game coordinator. Chad Morton was the running game coordinator in addition to coaching those specific positions. Like we talked about with Morton, though, you can imagine if the Bears have a vacancy at wide receivers coach and they're interviewing the Seahawks wide receivers coach, that's probably the kind of position that he would be interviewing for with the Chicago Bears and could slot into that position. If Morton's going to be the running backs coach, Lal can be the wide receivers coach. That leaves the quarterbacks coach. And the third name that Shane Waldron has interviewed for the Chicago Bears is a man by the name of Kerry Joseph. Kerry Joseph, most recently, the Seattle Seahawks assistant quarterbacks coach, not the full quarterbacks coach, but the assistant quarterbacks coach. And Kerry Joseph, actually, he was a quarterback himself, didn't really stick in the NFL, but then went into the Canadian Football League and ended up taking them all the way to a championship. It's the Grey Cup up there is what they play in Canada, but still was the league's most outstanding player. I believe that's the equivalent of their MVP trophy out there. He had just a phenomenal season as a quarterback up there back in, I think 2007 was his peak year, but bounced around the CFL quite a bit, has since obviously moved into coaching. And with the Seattle Seahawks, he has been just a sort of generic offensive assistant. Then he was promoted to assistant wide receivers coach, and most recently has done assistant quarterbacks coach. That's not to say then he's automatically guaranteed the full quarterbacks coach job in Chicago, but it's kind of interesting that he's one of the headline names we get there and not, their current quarterbacks coach, we'll talk about in a little bit here, or any of the other potential names that could fill that role. So you could easily see Joseph as the QB coach, Lal as the wide receivers coach, Morton as the running backs coach, and that's filling your 3 big vacancies on this coaching staff. QB, running back, wide receiver. You got that. Your O-line and your tight ends coach. That's all the assistant coaches you need. But you do have room to add more potential coaches in there. And also, a guy like Kerry Joseph could be an assistant quarterbacks coach, and you could still hire a different quarterbacks coach. You could make any of those guys assistant position coaches and hire in a new full position coach, or vice versa. Make these guys the position coach and still go out and hire an assistant position coach. So we'll go through some of the other names to keep an eye on with this. Just because these guys are interviewing in Chicago doesn't mean for sure that they're going to take this job in Chicago. They could end up following another coach to another opportunity and leave that vacancy still to be filled by someone else for the Bears. So we'll look at a few other names that Shane Waldron could look at with some familiarity to him and also some familiarity for the Chicago Bears, and how you can start to play with some of the titles here to get more coaches on your coaching staff. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks, the fastest and easiest way to play daily fantasy sports, because PrizePicks puts you in complete control. You pick 2 to 6 players, and whether they'll perform better or worse than their PrizePicks projection, and you can win up to 25 times your money just by getting your picks right. Unlike the other daily fantasy platforms where you're setting a lineup, and then it's your lineup against 1,000 other lineups and trying to outproduce everybody else, all the pros and the sharks that are in that same competition with you. No, with PrizePicks, it's just your picks versus the projection. So all you got to do is be correct, and you win. It's a lot of fun. It can give you some extra stakes in these playoff games, certainly in the basketball season, in the hockey season, college sports as well. There's a lot of different ways you can play with PrizePicks. So if you want to try it for yourself, go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use our promo code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. It's an extra $100 to play with at prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. So we know the 3 candidates the Chicago Bears and Shane Waldron are interviewing for this offensive staff so far, but it's no guarantee that those 3 guys will all be hired and that all those 3 guys will fill the QB, running back, wide receiver coach's role, or that they might not find room to squeeze more than one of these coaches in there. And I think there's a few other names to keep an eye on here that have connections to Shane Waldron that the Bears would also certainly be interested in, because 3 of the other coaches that the Bears interviewed for the OC position that they gave to Shane Waldron also have worked before with Shane Waldron. And so if, they didn't get the Bears OC job, but still want to be a part of this team, still want to be a part of the staff, as opposed to being potentially unemployed if they don't have a job right now, or just in a lesser role somewhere else, maybe being Waldron's assistant wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. So, for example, the name we didn't talk about yet from the Seattle Seahawks coaching staff, Greg Olson. Again, that's Olson, the quarterback's coach for the Seahawks this season, not the former Chicago Bears tight end who's now, broadcaster for Fox, who does a great job, in my opinion. Greg Olson was interviewed as the potential Bears offensive coordinator. The Bears declined and took his offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron, instead for that role. But perhaps Greg Olson might like working with Shane Waldron and might like working with getting to be the quarterback's coach for either Justin Fields or the number 1 overall pick in the draft. It could be a very enticing quarterback's coach job. And certainly Greg Olson has as much quarterback coaching experience as anybody you could hope for on the quarterback coaching market. Of course, prior to being the Seattle Seahawks quarterback's coach this year, he was previously offensive coordinator for the Las Vegas Raiders, offensive coordinator for the Jacksonville Jaguars, offensive coordinator for the Oakland Raiders, separate stints with the Raiders, offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, offensive coordinator for the St. Louis, at the time, Rams, and offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions. And even long before that, way back in the far and away age of, I think, 2003 or 2004, he was quarterback's coach for the Chicago Bears. So he's had that exact coaching role on this exact coaching team just literally 20 years ago, which is kind of shows you how much he's been around the NFL. But obviously, a lot of experience as a coordinator, a lot of experience working with quarterbacks, has sort of taken the reins from Dave Canales in terms of working with Geno Smith and Drew Lock in Seattle. Certainly doesn't deserve credit for unlocking Geno Smith. That kind of happened before Greg Olson got there. But clearly there's already some symmetry. There's some synergy there, with Waldron and Greg Olson. I could see if Olson says, yeah, screw it. I didn't get the OC job, and I don't have a job in Seattle right now, so I might as well roll with this and work with the quarterback that might be more of something I can mold into something great and get a lot of credit for helping either develop Justin Fields or develop this number 1 overall pick quarterback. Like, again, I think this is an intriguing option for a potential quarterback's coach like Greg Olson. And for him, it wouldn't be like a demotion or anything. It'd just be the same position he had in Seattle underneath the same offensive coordinator. Seems like it could be pretty enticing to me. How about another guy that I think will want something better, will aim higher perhaps for a better role somewhere, but if he doesn't find it, he could find a home in Chicago working with a coach he has, again, worked with before as a part of this coaching search process. Another one who interviewed for the Bears offensive coordinator job and did not get it, but Thomas Brown. He was most recently the offensive coordinator for the Carolina Panthers this past season with Bryce Young. Obviously didn't work out well there organizationally, the Carolina Panthers are a bit of a mess, and he was a casualty of that. But prior to being with the Rams, they started partnering with the Panthers. Floridian slip there. He was with the Rams, which is what I was getting at. He was the tight ends coach with the Rams, and before that, he was the running backs coach with the Rams. And when he was a position coach with the Rams, he was also there at the same time as Shane Waldron, who was the Rams passing game coordinator during that stretch. Shane Waldron, I think also while he was there, was briefly a position coach as well, but mostly passing game coordinator across his multiple years with the Los Angeles Rams. And so they've worked together as position coaches together. I think Thomas Brown was a running backs coach in college before that. So a lot of experience as an RB coach. Certainly you'd feel like it's a steal if you're getting an offensive coordinator caliber candidate to be your running backs coach. And maybe he doesn't want to take a running backs coach job, but maybe you can find a way to finesse this, as we'll talk about in a little bit, by potentially making him a run game coordinator or something along those lines. I mean, could you make Chad Morton an assistant running backs coach and make Thomas Brown running backs coach? I don't know if Morton would want that demotion either, but it's all different ways you can start to move this around and try and get quality coaches added to your staff if they're available and interested. And clearly he was interested in the OC position in Chicago. Would he like to work with Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson and whoever they end up bringing in running back behind them in this group? It's a quality running team, quality running backs that could be good for him to work with on the resume. One other guy that I think is probably the least likely of the three, given his coaching changes as of late, but Another one who interviewed for this Bears offensive coordinator position, Liam Cohen, who is currently the offensive coordinator for the University of Kentucky, but the year before that, 2022, he was offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams under Sean McVay. The year before that, he was the offensive coordinator at Kentucky. So he's done every other year. He's alternated the last 3 years. He went from the Rams to Kentucky, back to the Rams, and now back to Kentucky. He reportedly told Kentucky, like, this time that he came back, he was not going to be a one-and-done guy again, but then he interviewed for the Bears offensive coordinator job, and I believe he interviewed for at least one other offensive coordinator job, and much like Thomas Brown, like, either one of those guys could still get an OC job somewhere else and still not be available to the Bears. But, like, if Cohen wants to get back out of college and back into the NFL, he was previously the Rams assistant quarterbacks coach, and prior to that, assistant wide receivers coach, so he's coached a couple positions with Shane Waldron on that same coaching staff as Thomas Brown. So, there's clearly a lot of connections here with these McVay guys that have gone on different teams. Could they all reunite under Waldron in Chicago and try and revamp some of that coaching staff here and try and get that magic going under Waldron with guys he's worked with before, but just didn't specifically work with in Seattle? And is there room to squeeze all these coaches on there? Because one of the potential loopholes here is, in addition to having position coaches, you can also go out and hire a run game coordinator and a pass game coordinator that can either be titles added to a position coach, or it can be their outright title. You can be a pass game coordinator and not be a position coach. Shane Waldron was that with the Los Angeles Rams. So that's an opportunity. You could hire a guy like, say, Thomas Brown, who's been a running backs coach before, to be your run game coordinator. So he's not a position coach, but you can still find a spot for him on your roster. Or you could hire Liam Cohen, not as your offensive coordinator, because you've got Shane Waldron, but he could be your pass game coordinator and not be the QB coach or the wide receivers coach, just the passing game coordinator. So he's got a spot on your staff. He's more than just a position coach, and he gets to be a part of this coaching staff with a bunch of guys that he's coached with before. That's like the loophole to be able to get some of these guys on there, in addition to the likes of Terry Joseph and Sanjay Lal and Chad Morton that we already talked about. That run game and pass game coordinator title is also a loophole for how you can try to hire guys away from other teams. Say a position coach who's currently a position coach for another team that you want on your staff, but you can't make him offensive coordinator, but you could offer him a promotion as a run game coordinator or a pass game coordinator. So we'll go through some of the other names on other staffs that you could potentially lure away by giving them a slight promotion on their job title next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what helps keep your vehicle alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your car and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your car or truck, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. We've gone through the names that we've heard about so far. Offensive guys that Waldron is interviewing for sure, and then other offensive guys that he's worked with before that have already interviewed with the Bears that you'd love to have somewhere on Shane Waldron's coaching staff. But the pool expands beyond that, and there are other guys that Shane Waldron has worked with throughout his career that are either available and would need some kind of different title to work in Chicago, or are currently coaching for another team and would need some kind of promotion in order to be able to interview them and lure them away from their team, as opposed to a lateral move. Like if he's already a wide receivers coach somewhere else, you can't just make him wide receivers coach here unless the other team gives you permission to interview him and hire him for that role. So you need to promote somebody to passing game coordinator or running game coordinator in order to be able to lure that person over from that team. A few names I want to go through here. First of all, there are two other offensive assistants on the Seattle Seahawks this season, and for the last couple seasons, that haven't been interviewed in Chicago or aren't on this list yet because the Bears have an offensive line coach and a tight ends coach. And so the Seattle Seahawks also have an offensive line coach and tight ends coach that perhaps Shane Waldron could be interested in bringing over with him. The Seattle Seahawks offensive line coach is Andy Dickerson. He's been there for a while. He was previously the Rams assistant offensive line coach for a long time, thus the Shane Waldron connection. He was, at one point, the Seahawks running game coordinator under the previous offensive coordinator, Brian Schottenheimer. But when Waldron came in, he lost the run game coordinator title, but it's clearly he's been a run game coordinator before. And if the Bears already have an offensive line coach, so you're not going to hire Andy Dickerson to Chicago as you already have an offensive line coach, you can't give him that job. But could you bring him to Chicago as the run game coordinator? Absolutely. If Waldron likes him and wants his input on the offense, there's a way to get another guy from Seattle without making him that same position coach. Same thing with the Seattle Seahawks tight ends coach, Pat McPherson. He's been there a long time, decades. I think he started there in 2010, I believe. And I got to double check, is that before Pete Carroll? I mean, that's no, he started at the same time as Pete Carroll did in 2010 as their tight ends coach. And was their tight ends coach every year for, 14 years? I mean, it's probably more Pete Carroll loyal than Shane Waldron loyal specifically there. But if Waldron likes him, you already have a tight ends coach in Chicago. Could you make him your run game coordinator or your passing game coordinator here, right? Those are where you have the opportunities to still add more guys from the Seattle Seahawks staff. Some other guys, position coaches that are currently on other teams that Shane Waldron has worked with before and maybe would really like to reunite, but you're going to need to give them some kind of promotion in order to be able to reunite them. How about a couple of names that might be familiar as former Chicago Bears coaches as well? Does the name Skip Peete ring a bell for you? This one's a little bit more recent. Skip Peete is currently the Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs coach, but you might remember him as the Chicago Bears running backs coach, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago. It's been a little while, but it's still fairly recently. In between those, though, he was the Rams running backs coach with Shane Waldron as their passing game coordinator. So worked together under McVay with the Rams. He also had a stint with the Dallas Cowboys as a running backs coach in between there as well. He's been a running backs coach in the NFL for a long time. And so the Bears could make him, they can't exactly make him running backs coach without permission from the Buccaneers, but you don't need permission if you make him run game coordinator. So that's an opportunity where if Waldron really wants Skip Peete, you can go get that guy or another guy that you would need to make run game coordinator because you already have an offensive line coach. This is a name that might trigger you a little bit, or you might wince when you hear the name, because again, I'm not necessarily advocating for bringing this guy in, but a guy with a Shane Waldron connection that we got to talk about, Aaron Kromer. He's currently the Buffalo Bills offensive line coach. You probably remember him as the offensive coordinator under Mark Trestman, who famously leaked to the media complaining about Jay Cutler and was kind of ousted and outed for that, and everything deteriorated. I mean, that was in the midst of a massive deterioration anyway, but very, very messy in Chicago last time Aaron Kromer was here. And so I wouldn't say likely that he would be brought in as a run game coordinator, but before he was with Buffalo, he was with the Los Angeles Rams and Shane Waldron under Sean McVay as running game coordinator and offensive line coach. So if Shane Waldron likes him as a running game coordinator, that's how you can steal him from Buffalo if you really want him in Chicago, even though you already have an offensive line coach. And he's already an offensive line coach, so you can't make the lateral move, but make him run game coordinator and offensive line coach, then you've got a chance to snag him there. Again, I guess more or less saying fingers crossed they don't do that, because he didn't rub me the right way, certainly the last time he was here, but he keeps getting NFL jobs, so he's got to know some kind of something. One other name that's not as familiar, and then one other wild card I'll throw in here. Eric Yarber is the Los Angeles Rams wide receivers coach right now. Has been since 2017. Has been wide receivers coach there since Shane Waldron joined the Rams first and then left the Rams. So they worked together for 18, 19. Shane Waldron was with the Rams for, 4 seasons, 17, 18, 19, 20 as an assistant coach. So worked with him for 4 years when Eric Yarber was the receivers coach for all 4 of those years, has been the receivers coach ever since, has certainly developed some good receivers, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, for example, with the Los Angeles Rams. If Waldron values that really well and can't get him as just the wide receivers coach, but you got to make him passing game coordinator, that's how you can go and get him. Yarber previously coached for the Buccaneers and 49ers as wide receivers coaches as well, so he's been around the block a little bit throughout there. And then one other name that you're not going to see him be a position coach or any kind of full-time coach, I wouldn't imagine, but it's worth pointing out that Shane Waldron has worked with Jay Gruden. He was a part of Jay Gruden's staff with the Washington I think they were the previous team name back at the time. In 2016, Shane Waldron was on Jay Gruden's offensive staff in Washington. And then obviously Jay Gruden was fired. I forgot he spent a year as a Jaguars offensive coordinator before that. But then in 2022, Jay Gruden was an offensive consultant with the Los Angeles Rams and Sean McVay because they've worked together. So I'm not saying Shane Waldron would hire Jay Gruden as an assistant coach, like a coordinator or a passing game coordinator or a position coach. But I could see Jay Gruden being a candidate as one of these offensive consultants. Just like last year when Matt Eberflus hired Phil Snow to be like a senior defensive analyst. I just wonder if there's any still connection there with Waldron and Jay Gruden, if somebody like Gruden could be brought around as a potential offensive consultant or offensive analyst. Just one other big name coach I wanted to mention with a Shane Waldron connection. Not saying I advocate for it, but just trying to cast a wide net of here, like who could Shane Waldron ultimately end up bringing in? And having the ability to make these guys run game or pass game coordinators is one of the potential ways you can steal them. Now, the caveat to being able to steal guys that way is if I'm a team, like let's use Aaron Kromer as the example because it's the most name recognizable there for all of us, I think. Aaron Kromer is the Bills' offensive line coach. If the Bears go to Aaron Kromer and say, hey, we want to interview you to be our run game coordinator, the Buffalo Bills could then go to Aaron Kromer and promote him to offensive line coach / run game coordinator, and then it would be a lateral move. So think of it almost like restricted free agency, right? Where it's like you can go to these coaches and offer them a promotion to run game coordinator, but their current team essentially has the opportunity to match that by making them also run game coordinator. And then it's kind of up to that coach to either accept that promotion to stay with his current team or to kind of like decline that promotion to ultimately go on to the new team that are making run game coordinators. So like the Buffalo Bills, like they don't have an a run game coordinator or a pass game coordinator right now. So if the Bears tried to make Aaron Kromer the Bears run game coordinator, the Bills could promote Aaron Kromer to run game coordinator / offensive line coach. Then it's a lateral move, and the Buffalo Bills could block the interview and say, no, Bears, you can't have him. So it's not a foolproof way to lure these guys over to steal them from their current teams, but it would force any of their current teams to have to promote them in order to prevent them from coming over, which at the end of the day, like does reward that coach. So, you end up helping out your buddy either way. If you're buddies with Aaron Kromer and you want him to be your run game coordinator, you either get him as your run game coordinator or you get him promoted at his current job, which is a nice little way to help him out through that process too. So that's why it's worth mentioning some of these other coaches on other teams because they're still out there. They're still available. There's still a chance to promote them here. But I think right now, Chad Morton, Sanjay Lal, and Kerry Joseph are your likely running backs coach, wide receivers coach, and quarterbacks coach there. Unless you make Kerry Joseph your assistant quarterbacks coach and make Greg Olsen then your full quarterbacks coach. But that to me feels like the most likely path at this point for the Bears coaching staff. But there's room to make guys like Liam Cohen or Thomas Brown a passing game coordinator or make an Andy Dickerson or a Skip Pete or whoever a run game coordinator and get more coaches on this staff. More coaches doesn't always mean better. By the way, like sometimes you have too many cooks in the kitchen. There's not a perfect way to do this. It just depends on how Waldron runs his team and runs his staff and which guys he wants around and which guys are willing to come with him to Chicago. If the Bears make any big splash hires as assistant coaches, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up this week, we got to break down the candidates that are interviewing for the Bears defensive coordinator position. A few outside names to keep an eye on there that have some really intriguing backgrounds that could be fun additions to this Chicago Bears defense. And then next week, I'm heading to Mobile, Alabama for the Senior Bowl, the week of practices of a bunch of the top college prospects all coming to get down there. The Bears tight ends coach Jim Dre will be coaching the offensive linemen for one of the teams down there, so we'll get a close look at them, and we'll see what Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus are scouting in person down at the Senior Bowl as well. We're going to have some great in-person podcast interviews with some of your favorite media members, including potentially a former player who's a friend of the show that we'll get on here, assuming he's going to be down there and ready to join us on the podcast. So a lot of good stuff coming in the next couple weeks. Make sure you keep coming back, making Locked On Bears your first listen, because then that way every day you get another opportunity to bear down.